Ladies and gentlemen, in this Red Gaming video, we're going to be discussing the DirectX 12 GDC conference. This is going to be an early technical and performance analysis of all the revealed features. Bear in mind that there's a heck of a lot of stuff that we have to get through and analyze, but this is just some of the pertinent parts that I think we really want to discuss regarding the performance, and there is a massive DirectX 12 performance boost that I want to get into. This is an article as well, which has tons of technical slides from GDC. They were in video format, so if you want to go and look at those, you can do. The article, of course, is linked naturally in the video description. With that said, I'm going to jump in just to go back just for a second, actually. The full technical thing, the full technical analysis will probably be over the next couple of days, because quite frankly, they've not released all of the information yet, because obviously GDC is still going. And so obviously, once that's come out, and about a week or two after that, there's going to be all the slides most likely put up as well, so we can delve even further into it, and it's probably going to take a couple of weeks. But here's my initial early impressions. First, there's some good news. DirectX 12 is largely complete, and the drivers from the three major vendors, Intel, AMD, and Nvidia, are fully functioning. So what this basically means is that the DirectX 12 that is currently being shown off in demos and so on is pretty much what we're going to be really playing with Windows 10 or what have you. In other words, there's not really going to be that many major changes that are coming. There are apparently 400 members who are working on the development with early SDK access, and this equals to about 100 studios, so it's no small effort to say the least. So, vastly greater development control on how content could be rendered, and this is said by the presenter of the GDC conference, Max McMillan, and he is the development lead over at Direct3D for Microsoft. He was really confident, I've got to say, when he took to the stage, and he said that the PC is going to be achieving console level efficiency, performance, and control. Now, of course, we all know that it's going to be a low-level API, and it's going to be multi-vendor and so on, and remember that there are still a lot of bits and bobs which are still unknown. But anyway, if regarding the Xbox One, we don't know too much. All he says is there's going to be greater performance, and there's going to be lower access to console hardware. Now, in terms of the mobile platform, primarily it's going to be power and performance increases, which is a good thing. So, after some time on stage where he went through a variety of different technical details regarding the various functionality, and we will touch on some of those in this article, but after some time, Kesper Engelstoft, hopefully I'm pronouncing that correctly, who is the Unity graphics engineer, he was brought on stage, and his job was basically to tell other developers, here's what we found when we were porting Unity to DirectX 12. He pointed out, just to give you guys a little bit of an insight into this, that they first got their hands on the SDK in September, and it took them a couple of weeks because fortunately their shader pipeline was fairly compatible with DX12. It was basically generating the code in the right way, the correct bytecode, so it only took them a few weeks to get up and running. It wasn't particularly well optimized, but once they'd done that, everything was good. After various changes to the SDK, so obviously they had SDK 2 and 3, every time they received a new one, something broke or the performance shot all the way down because I had to basically jiggle their code. But the good news is, for the most part, things are working really well now. So what he did is he decided to show off shadow maps in the Unity engine. If you're not too sure what a shadow map is, in its most basic, it's just simply the shadowing of a scene. A shadow is usually created to test whether a pixel is visible from a light source, and then obviously from there it will project a shadow. So let's just, for example, say that you've got a table light coming, shining on, let's say, a vase to the left. Then obviously its job is to create, oh look, this is the direction of the light, here's the size of the shadow, and so on and so forth. So, they were trying to push multi-threading, multi-thread shadow maps, and it's been something that they say is very easy for developers to adopt into their existing engines, particularly Unity engines anyway, are really easy. And it's a very massive, a huge performance boost. So, they were conducting an artificial test. In other words, it wasn't a game running, it was literally just an artificial test scene for purposes of like control and so forth. And they wanted to see just what they could get out of it. So they set up 7,000 objects, which might sound a lot, but it's not that many compared to what we could be running. But in this case, 7,000 objects, and those are being lit by 3 directional lights, okay? And there are 3 shadow maps on the main renderer of DX11, and it took 23 milliseconds to render. So on the DirectX 12, the main worker thread, the rendering thread, builds the scenes commands list. Basically, it acts as a control and tells all the other worker threads to generate the shadow maps command list. In other words, it's delegating the work to the rest of the CPU cores. The data is then synced up. So in other words, all the data from all of the various CPU cores is synced up and then it's executed. So now the shadow maps are moved away from the main thread that's, say, you know, the CPU core 0, which is typically where most of the stuff is dumped onto. And the time has dropped down from 23 ms and all the way down to just 13 ms, which is a ridiculous saving. So just right there with shadow maps alone, that's a massive saving. Just think about that. 23 to 13 ms is huge, considering that it won't really take developers that long, and they can pretty much use the same technology they're running. That's massive, but there's more. This stuff is going to become quite technical, and I'm going to not glaze over it so much, but we will cover it much more in depth when more information is available. But for now, this is the brief summary. So execute indirect was definitely something that Max McMillan, of just to go back, he is of course the lead, if you will, on DirectX 12 at Microsoft. Max is very, very proud of execute indirect. And when he retook the stage, he said that the draw bundles are very cool. In fact, back last year, Microsoft made a massive big deal of draw bundles. It was one of the things that they were highlighting in all the bits and bobs. But he said that one of the problems with draw bundles and DirectX 12 is, ironically enough, the GCP, that's the graphics command processor, which is on the actual GPU. Now what that does is it takes the rendering commands from the CPU and will then transfer those commands to the shaders of the GPU and other fixed function hardware. In other words, it will set up the jobs and basically say to the GPU, here's how I need you to process this, and for the most part it will do it in the most efficient manner that it can. So it basically allocates the resources. The problem is that even handling draw bundles, the GCP can become overwhelmed. In other words, it physically can't keep up with all of the instructions that all of the CPU cores are sending it. So yeah, the bundles do help a lot. They really help to optimize the data, but at the end of the day, you're probably going to be GCP limited, at least on current hardware. So there's an argument that says, hey, being able to generate draw calls and other data directly on the GPU itself, so you don't really need to worry about interpretation, you don't need to worry about involving the CPU, which obviously has other major benefits as well, such as this memory utilization, it doesn't flood the PCIe bus, and so on and so forth. That's a really good thing. So just to give you an insight, GPUs have been really dumb, and by which I mean they haven't really been able to generate their own commands. They, for lack of another word, they are just unable to do much without the CPU telling them what to do. But GPUs steadily, particularly over the last, say, 5 years, have definitely improved this. And so any DX12 hardware is capable of doing this. What it's going to do is it will allow you to generate multiple draw calls from just a single CPU instruction. It saves a massive amount of CPU usage. This indirect buffer can actually be used by the CPU accessible, left to be CPU accessible. So in other words, the CPU can consistently stream more data into the GPU, or it's just purely GPU accessible. So in other words, the CPU is like, hey, I told you what to do, get on with it. Now, Eventually he loads up the Asteroids demo, and you might remember that this was originally constructed back in the day by Intel. So there were some changes to this. Basically, Microsoft took the code that was already there and assumed everything was bindless. In other words, they made it so that they set up all the shader resources up front. All of that was set up up front. And this means, from the originally, you might recall that each and every asteroid was represented by... this means that each and every asteroid can be represented with a single draw call, with a single call. Whereas you might remember that the original asteroid demo, each of those asteroids, although each of them looked the same, and it just looked like there were mirrors if you kind of look at them at distance, each was actually a unique drawn object, if you will. Each had its own trajectory and parameter and all of that stuff. So it's not like they were just, clones, for lack of a better word. So, here's the deal. Microsoft first loaded up DirectX 11 version of this, and it was 28 frames a second. Okay, fine. It's pretty much, 30 FPS, not awful, right? It's not ideal, but it's not bad. Then Microsoft switched to DirectX 12. And doing so, it raised it by a factor of 3. It went to like the low 70s. And then what happened is the CPU workload breaks over to multiple processor cores and becomes noticeably higher. Next, Microsoft then enabled the switch for Assume Bindless, and DirectX 12 gained another 10% of performance. Finally, the frame rate, by the way, is around 80-ish now, hovering obviously depending on what's going on screen, but they once again added one more improvement. They added Execute in Direct, and the performance now goes up to 90 frames a second, so it's about another 10% boost. And this is, remember, DirectX 11 had 28. So you've now gone from 28 to 90. With Execute Execute in Direct, the CPU usage was, prior to this, it was running at 25%. Now, once they enabled Execute in Direct, it went down to just 9% usage, which is absolutely madness. Because there's no perceivable difference to gamers, and that's the real key here. Because it means that there's just so much resource saving. It's just absolutely crazy. And the sad fact of the matter is, we don't even know the real crux of the matter here, because there's so many little features which are rumored for DirectX 12 which Microsoft still haven't confirmed or debunked. Like, for example, just one of those examples is obviously the improvements to multi-GPUs. And there are hints that some of the stuff is in, but not all of it. So, Fable Legends is next. What they did, he switched to a live demo, and it was DirectX 12 versus DX11. The live video was showing DirectX 11 running at 900p, while DX12 was running at 1080. So, while DirectX 12 was running at 1080p, it also had a very slightly higher frame rate as well, and it just gives you an indication of what really, you're able to actually achieve with this sucker. And then finally, they had another test. Now, these are UAV barriers. We'll get into what a UAV barrier is in just a second. But what they did is, first of all, they enabled it as DirectX 11 style sync. And this frame rate was not bad. It was mid-40s to 50s, which isn't awful. And then they switched to optimal UAV patterns. Now, you can kind of consider to be UAV, by the way, stands for unordered axis views, and they work a little bit like a pixel shader render target, but there are a number of key differences. Most of it is, for example, is not really in a specific order. It supports atomic operations and a hell of a lot of other bits and bobs besides. This could get really complicated. I've put links in the description, in the article, if you want more information on this stuff, because it's going to basically eat up a lot of video time just to talk about that. But what they did then, is they then switched it to an optimized, and once they switched it to optimized, the frame rate jumped to 64 frames a second. So what does all of this mean? Well, Microsoft have obviously developed this to be a much more console-like API. It's going to spread the workload over a lot more GPUs and yet CPU cores. And yes, it does have still a layer of abstraction. And yes, it's not like you're coding completely and utterly to the metal. In other words, Microsoft do make sure that, you know, simply because of the multiple hardware vendors, for example, AMD, Nvidia, and so on, and some of their architectures are quite different, there is some abstraction that does, you know, is simply required, because otherwise you would have to code for each and every GPU out there, and that's not really feasible for a developer to do. But the fact of the matter is that Xbox One games will see an improved performance and will bring the same API to all Microsoft platforms, and that's what Microsoft have said. So the fact of the matter is, in terms of performance, DirectX 12 is a massive step forward. For the PC, as I've mentioned, it's going to be major because of improvements to multi-threading. It's going to be major because it's going to be a lot easier to develop for. It's going to make much better use of hardware. For example, AMD's FX 8000 range CPUs are going to probably benefit from this quite heavily, because obviously their per core performance is not really where you'd want it to be for a high-end gaming rig, ideally. I mean, that's not to say that, for example, 8300 series CPU can really do gaming quite well, but you do notice a large disparity between it and, say, let's say 4670K. Whereas with DirectX 12, the playing field should even out quite a bit, and it will also be beneficial for developers because, in theory at least, they won't need to worry so much about the performance of just a single thread. In fact, they can more leverage the entire device and the entire performance of the device, which is really handy. And that's why a lot of games recently, if you've been looking at the specifications of a lot of PC games, they really require quite a beefy CPU with a high clock speed, simply because of that issue, because that main rendering thread is having all of the workload pushed onto it, and so you've got this problem where it's basically at 100% CPU time, and you've got the other, like, you know, say 3 CPU cores that are doing very little in comparison. So there's that. There are some questions, no doubt. One of the big ones is the 20% going to really, or what have you, really going to translate to the Xbox One? I would point out that yes, the Xbox One's performance theoretically is limited because it's fixed platform. And so you can't get a situation where, you know, the 1.32T flop GPU is suddenly going to be magically overclocked or something like that, and it's going to suddenly be running at like 1.8T flops or something. But what it can do is it become more efficient of what it's got at the moment. In other words, it can do more with the performance that it's already got. It can be more efficient with it. And if it can do that, then performance naturally will go up as a direct result. The problem is there's still a lot of questions regarding how DirectX 12 is going to interact with the Xbox One. And unfortunately, a lot of this, at least at the moment, with the information we have, and obviously over the next week or two more of this will be unveiled, but from right now, the 2nd, 5th of March, a lot of this stuff is still mysterious. The benefit, however, for us as customers is not to be overlooked. The real main point is that it's going to mean much better cross-platform development for developers. It's going to mean that we as consumers get better looking games and hopefully better performance in games as well. And another side benefit is, well, it's coming quite soon, to be totally honest. Microsoft have stated that there's going to be a PC version, a preview of DirectX 12 coming out later this year, and of course most PC gamers already know about the whole Windows 10, how it's going to integrate into the ecosystem. My point being, for the next year or so, it's going to be very exciting in both PC and console space. It's going to be insane, it really will be. With all of that said, hopefully you've got some details on how DirectX 12 is going to work. Now, I know this has been a little bit of an overview, but I didn't want to do a full technical analysis simply because so much information is still coming out. So what I didn't want to do is go really into depth into something and then find out in just a day's time, because GDC is still running, that I kind of missed out on a whole thing. I'd rather just do it as like a series and know kind of what we're going up against. So I'm thinking by the weekend we'll at least know more details on GDC, and you know, most of those details would have come out. As I said, there's also going to, of course, be the natural PDFs. Microsoft are being really aggressive with DirectX 12, and by which I mean, I don't mean it in a negative way. I mean that they're being really boastful. They know they're onto something good. They've had massive industry players like Nvidia, AMD, Epic, Unity, and so on and so on and so on. Everyone's come on stage and said, hey, this is really cool. In the future, in the not too distant future, when the dust settled after GDC, maybe in a month or so, so probably early April, we can actually start doing some really good comparisons between it, Mantle, GL Next, and so on, and actually know what the hell it's going to mean for us as developers, or sorry, us as gamers, us as developers, us as users at the end of the day. Microsoft are, I've got to say, doing some really cool stuff. Even the ability to stream from the PC to the Xbox One, or from the Xbox One to the PC, I kind of think that's all awesome. And I think that it's going to make them a really good player in the industry. Now, I know some people are going to ask, well, what does this mean for the PlayStation 4? What is it going to mean for, you know, Linux and other operating systems as well? Well, to be totally honest, most of this information is unknown. With regards to the PS4, technically speaking, its GPU is completely and utterly DirectX compliant. It is, but obviously, Sony have their own low-level PSSL, PlayStation Shader Language, and its own APIs and SDKs that it's working on. Unfortunately, despite the fact we've got the Xbox One SDK leak, and that's not complete, and it's also a little old now, and clearly it does not go into the DX12 stuff. I wish it did, but it doesn't. But who knows what they're going to release in the future, because obviously they're doing their own, be able to create your own applications in someone with the Xbox One. So what I'm saying is Microsoft have their fingers in a lot of pies, but how this stuff is going to actually compare in terms of A, performance, B, development time and ease of creation, and C, as actual user experience and reliability, is completely and utterly a question mark. But with all of that said, hopefully you found this at least somewhat informative. But as I said, do check out the article if you want more technical details. This is kind of my overview and my thoughts and opinions thus far. And there's going to be a hell of a lot more over the next couple of days. But this is just my really early impressions and thoughts and opinions on the whole thing. But with that said, take care and bye for now.